Hi, I'm Nathan Nalla, the founder and director of Be the Riot. So we at Be the Riot support organizations to create inclusive workplace culture. We do this mostly through the development and delivery of learning content around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and also providing organizations with support to understand the challenges and the experiences that may exist within their employee base and within their workforce, to use this knowledge to then create EDI strategy. So the topic of EDI learning, I think, is a very important one, especially considering some of the societal challenges that we've seen over the past few years in the UK. Of course, there's COVID and the impacts of COVID. Um, there's also a number of challenges around sort of race and ethnicity, around sex, gender, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and a lot of these sort of uh, perhaps societal conversations or challenges are sort of really topical at the moment. And what I've seen is that many learning and development directors within organizations are expected to take the lead on developing learning programs address some of these issues. And equity, diversity, and inclusion touches on a very broad range of topics. And so it's not easy to create something uh, for learning within the workplace. And so we're going to look at some points today. I'll actually have three questions for you, and I hope that if you give them proper consideration, they will help to ensure that your EDI learning program is successful. So the first question is, how have you identified specific EDI learning needs across your organization? This is a crucial first step in creating a successful EDI learning experience, and it shouldn't be any different from other workplace learning. It starts with identifying learning needs and setting objectives. So every organization has a unique culture and therefore specific needs relating to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI for short. From what I've seen, taking a one size fits all approach hasn't worked. Generic off the shelf learning content typically can't address nuanced issues, and in most cases simply doesn't dig deep enough to deal with complex and sensitive EDI topics effectively. So first, you'll have to understand the experiences of people within your organization and those interacting with your services, and also to understand the existing employee knowledge levels. Okay, so how are organizations identifying EDI learning needs and setting objectives in the real world? Well, let me introduce Nesta, the UK's innovation agency for social good. They partner with government, private, and third sector organizations to tackle some of society's biggest challenges, such as inequality, poor health, and climate change. And Be the Riot worked with Nesta to develop and deliver the beginnings of their EDI learning program. So one of the first steps Nesta took was rolling out a race in the workplace survey for all employees. The decision was made to focus on race and ethnicity as this had been highlighted as a priority area within their EDI strategy based on employee feedback, organizational demographics, and ethnicity pay gap reporting as well. So from the Race in the Workplace survey, they found that employees weren't 100% comfortable having conversations about race and ethnicity. They also found that employees without lived experience of racism or racial harm weren't attuned to recognizing microaggressions and lacked confidence addressing microaggressions. So, just as a side note, microaggressions tend to be those sort of more subtle and often indirect acts of discrimination. Another thing that they'd found was that there was real nuance between different ethnic groups, with the experiences of certain groups being more negative than others. So these findings were translated into key objectives. Some focused on policy and process changes, which we won't get into, and others focused on learning, such as raising awareness about workplace challenges related to race and ethnicity, helping employees become confident speaking about workplace issues relating to race and ethnicity, giving employees tools for both recognizing and responding to microaggressions, and giving employees specific practical actions that they can take to proactively be anti-racist rather than simply not racist, and having a meaningful impact on workplace culture. Although Nesta chose to focus on race and ethnicity because this was a priority area within their EDI strategy, they'd also collected data regarding other aspects of EDI through broader employee engagement surveys. Some organizations use focus groups, customer feedback, exit interview feedback, diversity monitoring data, as well as other sources. Ultimately, you want to understand what people are experiencing and what level of knowledge they have. The key is to find specific challenges so that the learning can be designed to address those issues. Having a clear understanding of the employee's learning needs and being equipped with specific learning objectives, we at Be the Riot went about developing learning content that would help take Nesta towards their desired outcomes. So the second question that I have for you today is what steps have you taken to ensure the learning content lands and has an impact? The next crucial step is creating and tailoring content to make an impact. With EDI topics, a list of do's and don'ts simply doesn't cut it. Simply listing the protected characteristics under the Equality Act and warning employees not to discriminate isn't likely to have much of an impact on day-to-day culture. Like all learning, the desired outcome should be culture change. This comes about through behavior change, which stems from perspective change. To achieve this with your EDI learning program, there are a few things to consider. 4 points. The first point is impacting hearts and minds. Consider how EDI topics can be explored in such a way that causes people to actually feel something, to generate a sense of empathy for those who experience barriers to inclusion, and also to generate passion for fairness, equality, and inclusion. You also want people to reflect on their own beliefs and behaviors. Centering the lived experiences of various groups is important here, bringing real stories to life in a way that's really relevant to the learner. With Nesta, we were sure to include real stories and created space for people to share their own stories within the learning environment. We also included Nesta's survey findings to demonstrate the relevance of the content. It wasn't an academic discussion about some theoretical concepts. It was about addressing their own cultural challenges experienced by their own colleagues who were sat right next to them. Point two is creating a safe space. So I found that most of us are uncomfortable speaking about topics such as racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, etc. It's even more uncomfortable for those who have experienced these forms of harm inside or outside of work. When developing EDI learning, this should be considered in your approach. It needs to be a safe learning environment. When working with Nesta, we took a few steps to create a safe space. One is that we discussed how hierarchy can impact how open people are in learning settings. So we decided to run workshops for senior leaders and directors separate from other employees. So at both levels, people didn't feel like the spotlight was on them. Managers were also encouraged to attend sessions separately from their direct reports. We started every workshop with an agreement which focused on things like being mindful of how we express ourselves, not sharing another person's story outside of the group, and also being present. So everyone in the room is expected to participate in some way. Learners were also invited to add their own points to the agreement. Another step we took was that we allowed people to take a break if the topic triggered difficult emotions for them. And although we welcomed people to share their lived experiences, there was no pressure to do so. If your learning program includes workshops, the facilitator holds a crucial role in creating a safe space. This means that they're skilled in facilitating sensitive topics and know how to respond to challenging situations without negatively affecting the learning process. It's important to consider safety for other forms of learning as well, such as e-learning and informal learning events. Point three is giving people practical takeaways. Coming back to creating culture change, a critique that I have of a lot of EDI learning content I've seen is that it does a good job of raising awareness about sort of specific EDI issues, but it tends to stop short of giving people the tools that they need to affect change. Your EDI learning should give people specific practical actions that they can take. These actions should be realistic and relevant to their role within the organization. With Nesta, having separate workshops for leaders meant that we could tailor those practical takeaways. Leadership discussions focused more on strategy and leading by example, whereas the workshops for other employees focused on interactions between colleagues and embedding best practices within their teams. The sessions themselves allowed learners to practice some of the new tools before applying them in the real world. The final point here is facilitating continued learning. Culture change is unlikely to be achieved through a one-time learning initiative. EDI topics are very broad, and we're constantly learning new things as our society evolves. The learning journey should be ongoing and also include refresher content. With Nesta, we introduced learning groups and self-led learning. We provided learners with additional resources to facilitate their own learning and discussions, holding themselves and colleagues to account. Nesta also developed an EDI dialogues series with specialist speakers sharing on different topics every month. They have employee-led network groups that share learning content via Slack channels and also run other initiatives. So for your learning program, go beyond short-term and long-term ideas. View EDI as a fixed learning item on the agenda. Consider how you can keep conversations going and keep influencing culture. So my third and final question for today is, what steps have you taken to measure the impact of EDI learning? Measuring the impacts of EDI learning shouldn't be overlooked. Ultimately, we want to know that the initiatives you've introduced are achieving the desired outcomes. I think people often assume that measuring culture change for EDI is too difficult, it's too complex. And it can be complex. It isn't as simple as checking a box to say everyone has attended a diversity and inclusion course. You want to know if people are behaving differently, making different decisions. So with any form of culture change, learning is just one aspect that can have an influence. It's important to recognize this when doing monitoring activities. The aspects of your wider EDI strategy, such as policy and changes to the ways of working, will of course also have an impact. So here are some steps that you can take. Tracking participant feedback. This is useful for understanding how learners found the content, but it isn't very useful for tracking behavior change. Employee engagement surveys. that specifically include specific questions about equity, diversity, and inclusion. This can be a really helpful tracking tool. Focus groups and forums can be helpful too, although the feedback is harder to quantify. You can still get a sense of how things are changing within the organization over time. Monitoring the number and nature of grievances and complaints. Ideally, you'd expect these to be reduced, but in some cases, EDI content can cause people to start reporting more incidents, which means the numbers go up. Here, it's important to measure outcomes of the complaints. Ideally, employees should be better equipped to handle such events. With Nesta, change was measured using pulse surveys. These were short questionnaires that the learners responded to before and after attending workshops. So the questions were about perceptions and understanding how people were likely to behave in certain scenarios. There was also feedback from the learning groups. So these were the voluntary groups that met to continue learning together beyond the workshops. This was only loosely monitored through employee feedback. Other organizations may choose to track this sort of activity more formally. Also, when the time comes, Nesta will compare data from their annual survey to understand how things have changed over the past 12 months. There are a lot of positive indications from the feedback so far. We know that culture change is an ongoing process. Final point to make here is that other organizations do monitor and measure change using their one-to-one and performance review processes. EDI-related goals are set at individual and team level, and employees commit to specific measurable actions. The EDI goals are then tracked alongside other performance goals. This approach is a great way to demonstrate a real organizational commitment to EDI, embedding it alongside other priorities such as sales. It's also a way to hold people accountable. So, to wrap up, equity, diversity, and inclusion should be a part of every organization's values and embedded into ways of working. If you want to create a successful learning program for EDI, be sure to, one, identify learning needs and set objectives. Two, create and tailor content to make an impact. And three, monitor culture change. I'm Nathan Nalla, founder and director of Be the Riot. Thank you so much for listening.